Hey everyone, my name is Maria and I am an artist working with pastels and pastel pencils. And in today's video, I am going to show you how I use these materials to create a snow leopard's eye. Throughout this tutorial, I will walk you through every step of the process, explaining the technique I use and the decisions I make along the way so that you can follow along and create your own drawings too. I like to start my studies by mapping out the main shapes as quickly and accurately as possible because obviously in realistic drawing, getting the proportions right is absolutely crucial. Because of that, my favorite way to achieve this is by using the grid method. So I start by drawing a square the size I want my final drawing to be, then I divide it into a simple grid and I apply that exact same grid to my reference photo. And that just makes it so much easier to get the proportions right from the very beginning without having to constantly erase and redraw. I also think this is a really nice learning tool because it trains your eye to look at what's actually there instead of drawing what you expect to see. Now, of course, you can absolutely sketch everything freehand if you prefer. I just tend to use the grid method because it saves me a lot of time and it means I can get much quicker to my favorite part of the process, which is building up the colors, the textures, and all the depth in the drawing. For this eye study, I drew an 8 by 8 centimeter square on white Pastelmat, which is my absolute favorite paper for working with pastels. And I've put here the reference photo next to the drawing so you can see what I'm working with. And what I'm doing is really just looking back and forth between the reference and the drawing. And I started by mapping out the really obvious shapes, like the darker fur markings and the larger light areas. And then I gradually work my way towards the eye. And then I just keep on adding those shapes until I feel like I have enough guidelines to confidently move on to applying color. When I do start applying color, I like to use PanPastels. And if you've never used them before, they are essentially a soft pastel in a pen, and they are amazing for covering large areas of paper quickly. They blend really smoothly, they don't leave visible strokes, and they also allow me to build a really even foundation for the rest of the drawing. Also, they work beautifully on this pastel matte paper that I'm using. The first thing that I want to do here is to basically get rid of the white of the paper, and this is called blocking. If I started building the drawing directly on this white, it would be much harder to judge how light or dark each new layer should be. And this is where the notion of value comes in. Values are simply how light or dark something is, regardless of the color, and they are much easier to get right and judge by comparison. Basically, once I establish a base layer that is somewhere in the middle, so a mid value, it becomes much more intuitive to decide whether each area needs to be lighter or darker from there. So instead of trying to match the details and the accurate colors of the reference, I am looking for the main value groups and the dominant base color within each one. For example, most of the snow leopard's face has a soft, warm gray undertone or warm brown undertone. So I put those down. Then I also use a lighter pale beige undertone and also some black to establish the deepest shadow areas. And these are not necessarily the final colors we will see in the finished piece, but they are the foundation that everything else will be built on. So, on top of these, I can bring brighter highlights, richer colors, and finer details. But these first colors really help tie the whole drawing together and make the later stages much easier. And at this point, there are still almost no details in the drawing, but if you compare it to the reference photo, you can already see that it's starting to come together. And that is really the power of spending time on your sketch and the base layers, because if those are accurate, everything you build on top becomes much easier. So, of course, this video is sped up quite a bit, but I really encourage you not to rush at this stage. To give you an idea, this whole study took me about 3 hours to complete, and I spent more than 30 minutes just working on the sketch and these base layers. And you'll probably notice that I haven't added any color to the eye yet, and that is completely intentional. Right now, all of my attention is on getting the colors, values, and texture of the fur right. And then once I am happy with that, I will shift my focus entirely to the eye. So I sort of compartmentalize the way I draw. And I just find that this just keeps the process much more organized and helps me give each part of the drawing the attention that it deserves. Now that the base layers are done, it's time to start adding the detail, and for that I will switch from the PanPastels to the pastel pencils. And one of the things that I love the most about pastel pencils is just how versatile they are. Simply by changing how sharp the pencil is or adjusting the pressure I apply, I can completely change the type of mark that I'm making. And this is very important because we adjust exactly these two things, the tip of the pencil and the pressure, as we build layers. And this is actually the key point of realistic pastel drawing. We can only achieve a realistic and three-dimensional look if we spend the time and the effort building the layers. So it cannot be rushed, it needs to be built slowly and with patience. And the first few layers that we make with the pastel pencils are still quite broad, so I'm using fairly blunt pencils rather than really sharp ones. So I'm not focusing on fine details yet. I have a few main goals in mind. And first, what I want to start doing is pushing the values a bit further. So I'm adding lighter grays where I can see the highlights, deepening the black markings, and increasing the contrast between the lighter and the darker areas. I also start adjusting the color temperature. So if an area looks a little too cool, I know that I will need to add some yellows or warm browns or oranges. And if it needs to be cooler, I will do the opposite. So I'm really just comparing the drawing to the reference and making these small color corrections. And even though I am not focusing on the fine details yet, I do like to start following the direction of the fur with the pencil strokes. That way, I'm already beginning to build the texture, and every new layer naturally adds a little more realism on top of the previous one. Here, I also like to work in sections rather than all over the drawing. And I start with a fur just below the eye, then work my way above it, and finally around towards the muzzle. And the process is always the same. I build several layers, adjust colors, push the values, and then also add gradually the texture. And then once I am happy with one section, I simply move on to the next one and repeat the exact same steps. Another thing that I like to keep in mind at this stage is the color palette that I'm working with. I try to be quite intentional about it and also keep it fairly limited. Rather than using every single color in the pencil set, I choose just a small selection that I know will work well together throughout the whole drawing. So for this snow leopard, I am mainly working with a couple of yellows to bring warmth into the fur, a nicely pigmented terracotta, a lighter and a darker brown, a lighter and a darker warm gray, and black for the deepest shadows. But I will be listing all of these materials in the description. Keeping the palette simple is really important because if we start mixing too many different colors together, it is very easy for the drawing to become muddy and lose that fresh, vibrant look. So a limited palette sort of helps keeping everything more cohesive and makes it much easier to build clean and luminous layers of color. Now, when we get to the top layers, how do we actually achieve that high level of detail? There are two things that I do as I gradually build up these layers. And the first one is that I start getting my pencils sharper and sharper. So that tip really needs to be nice and thin. And also, I start applying a lot more pressure than I did in the first layers. And this is very important that you only apply this pressure at the ends. And the reason for that has to do with what's called the tooth of the paper. So if you look closely at pastel paper, it isn't smooth. It has a textured surface that grabs and holds the pastel pigment. And every layer that we add feels a little bit of that texture. So if I pressed really hard from the beginning, I would feel that tooth much too quickly, and eventually the paper wouldn't be able to hold any more pigment. And that would make it basically impossible to keep refining the drawing and adding those really fine details. So we wouldn't be able to add layers. And that is another reason why I love working on Pastelmat. It can hold an incredible amount of layers before the tooth is completely filled, which gives me a lot more freedom to keep adjusting the drawing. And in that sense, it is a lot more forgiving than other types of paper. Now, another tip when we are trying to draw realistic fur, it is really important to see how the fur is actually growing. So, fur isn't a flat pattern of different colors, it is made up of thousands of hairs growing on top of one another. So, we really actually have these layers. And around the eye, for example, the lighter fur overlaps the darker markings underneath. So instead of drawing a hard edge between those two colors, it is important to actually draw individual lighter hairs extending over the darker ones. So it seems like a small detail, but it makes a really huge difference because it recreates the way the fur is layered in real life and immediately gives the drawing this illusion of depth that we want. And on that note, it's also important to think that different hairs are hardly ever visually perceived as having the same color. So, for example, if you look at the snow leopard from a distance, the face almost looks like one uniform gray. But when you look closely, that's not really what you see. So, even hairs that are technically the same color won't all look the same. Some are sitting right on the surface and catch a lot more light, while others are growing underneath and naturally just appear darker. So instead of coloring an area with one gray pencil and trying to build texture like that, um, I build that illusion by placing lighter hairs next to darker ones and letting your eye blend them together. So these small differences in value are what creates the softness, depth, and realism of the fur. Also, while fur usually follows one general direction, it isn't perfectly organized. So there are always a few stray hairs that stick out slightly or grow at a slightly different angle. So towards the end, on these top layers, I also like to go back in and add a handful of those individual hairs that break the pattern just a little bit. Again, it's a tiny detail, but it makes it look fluffier and softer and a lot more believable. One last thing that I would like to say about this part of the fur is that you shouldn't feel like every part of your drawing needs to have the exact same level of detail. So, for example, in this study, the eye is very much the focal point, so this central part of the drawing. And that is where I want to spend the most time adding the finest hairs and the strongest contrasts and details. So, as I move further away from the eye, so towards the outer part of the drawing, it is fine if the fur is a little bit softer and I have a little bit less detail. And actually, that difference in detail level really helps guide the viewer's eye naturally towards the most important part of the drawing instead of having every area competing equally for attention. At this point, I feel like the fur is pretty much finished, so it's finally time to move on to the eye. And the first thing that I like to do is using a black pencil to refine the outline of the eye. And because it is the focal point of the whole drawing, it is really important to get these shapes nice and accurate before moving on. I also use the black pencil to fill in the pupil and at the same time map out the reflections because they will be much brighter. So it's nice to leave the paper just untouched for now. And just like we did with the fur, I then block in the base color of the iris. Since we are working on a much smaller area, I do this with a blunt pastel pencil instead of a pen pastel. And looking at my reference, the iris has a beautiful green undertone, so that is the color I choose as my starting point. Again, I am looking for a middle value that I can both lighten and darken as I build the drawing. Then once that base is in place, I start building the volume of the eye. And I use a light ivory yellow to establish the brightest parts of the iris, and then gradually deepen the outer edge using darker greens and a little ultramarine blue. Because the eye is a sphere, keeping those edges darker immediately gives it a much stronger sense of depth and volume. Then, once those transitions are nicely blended, I sharpen my pencils and start adding all the little details that make an eye so interesting. So, if you look closely at the iris, it isn't smooth at all. It's full of tiny dots, irregular textures, and fine radial lines that usually extend outwards from the pupil. These details don't have to be identical to the reference, so here I got a little creative, but adding that variation makes the iris feel much more natural and realistic. I also like to spend a bit of time refining the reflections, and I will often add a subtle blue tint to reflect the color of the sky, as well as a soft shadow cast by the eyelashes across the top of the eye. And these little details really help sell the illusion that the eye is glossy and sitting inside the eyelids rather than just being a flat circle. Then to finish the eye itself, I add a few touches of ivory and white along the waterline and in the brightest highlights. So those small crisp highlights are what really create the illusion of moisture and make the eye look alive. Before calling it done, I always like to take a step back and look at the drawing from a little distance because this makes it much easier to spot little things that still need adjusting, whether that's a shadow that needs to be a bit darker, a highlight that could use stand out a little bit more, or an area that needs a little extra depth. For this drawing particularly, I felt like I could still push the values a little further, so I deepened a few of the darkest areas and strengthened some of the highlights, and also added a handful of extra hairs to make the fur feel just a little bit more natural and organic. And then finally, my favorite part of the whole process, adding the eyebrow whiskers. Keeping your pencil extremely sharp is key here. And I also like to gently rotate the pencil as I draw each whisker. That helps with keeping the line nice and crisp without disturbing the pastel underneath. Now, all that's left to do is to peel away the artist tape and reveal those clean, sharp edges. And with that, your snow leopard eye study is finished. Now, I really hope you enjoyed this tutorial and that you learned something new along the way. If you decide to give this drawing a try yourself, I would absolutely love to see it, so feel free to share it in the comments below. And if you would like to see more of my work, you can also scan the QR code on the screen to visit my Instagram, where I share new drawings and behind the scenes content much more regularly. If you enjoyed this tutorial, don't forget to subscribe. This is only the second tutorial in a series of 6 big cat eye studies, so there are still 4 more coming, each one with different colors, textures, and techniques. So thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.